Welcome, friends, to another episode of Cinematic Realms. I'm your host, John Webster, and with me, as always, but especially today, is the almost birthday boy, Jared Kozel. Your birthday is actually in 2 days, but we're celebrating today. So happy birthday.
Thank you very much. I will be 35 years young, which I'm perfectly content with that. It's a good age.
I would be perfectly content with that too. Especially being, having 5 years on you. I'm like, yeah, send me back to 35. Um, but yeah, but yeah. So it's yeah. So you're feeling good about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like everyone has their ups and downs with life, but I kind of feel like things are on the up right now. So I'm in a good place.
Are you going to be doing anything special for your birthday
Um,
this year?
I mean, I'll just be hanging out with my family on the actual day itself. The following weekend, I'm actually gonna take a trip down to LA. It's primarily for a conference, but I'll be seeing some old friends there, so that'll kind of be my actual birthday like treat. And then, of course,
Nice.
watching the Bad Batch and everything later in the week. Although we'll see if they leave me a lump of coal with the but I think it'll be good.
Yeah, I think we're both a little angsty about what we're gonna get with the finale of the Bad Batch. I think we both are very much hoping for some kind of extended finale, but the problem is that we just don't know,
Yeah,
and so it's hard to have expectations for the finale without knowing like how much we're gonna get. And
yeah,
I'm kind of doing the thing where I'm preparing for the not the worst, but like preparing for the least. Because like I remember when the Clone Wars was having its finale, um, I was fully confident that the final episode was going to be like a proper extended like big blowout finale. We didn't know at the time that the Bad Batch was coming, and that we were going to get kind of the wider galactic view of what Order 66 sort of meant for the clones at large, until like that premiere of the Bad Batch. So when I saw that runtime of like 24 minutes or something, I was like, oh. And I proceeded then to watch all 4 episodes
yeah,
of the Siege of Mandalore together, so I could still have like that big uh series, finale event. And so this time around, I'm like, prepare for a short finale episode, and then if we get like a 45 or a 70-minute finale, then I can just consider that gravy. Uh,
I I feel pretty confident we're gonna get at least 45, just because, as you've noted, the season was only 15 episodes, not 16. I kind of think they probably had the regular 16 episode order and just decided not to, you know, break it up into 2 episodes. But hopefully it'll be longer. And
yeah.
yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. Glad you could join us.
Yeah, welcome, Stephanie. And this is not a Bad Batch discussion before people get confused, but we couldn't help ourselves. Today we're talking about one of your favorite movies, Jared, a movie which I had not seen before, called Before Sunrise, which is the first in a trilogy of films. And before before we say anything else, I'll be like, actually kind of worries me a little bit that it's 3 movies, because I feel like the ending of this one is so perfect, and I'm like, don't disturb anything. I have like my own mental image of what happens after this, and I almost don't want that disturbed. But we'll that'll come at a later time. But I enjoyed it. It's
Good.
a very good film, and I imagine that my appreciation for it will probably increase after I see the next 2 films.
Mhm.
But since this was the movie that you wanted to discuss. Why don't we just start with you? And when did you see this film, and what's been your journey with it?
So I saw this film about 10 years ago now. So these movies, the first one, Before Sunrise, came out in 1995, and then the sequels, Before Sunset, came out 9 years later in 2004, and then the third and final movie to date in the trilogy, Before Midnight, came out in 2013. That was when I saw these movies because I had not seen Before Sunrise or Before Sunset when they had come out. I had really just started to get into like the larger area of cinema appreciation in the kind of early 2000s. Um, and so I hadn't caught up with it. These are smaller movies. I was familiar with Richard Linklater. I had great admiration for his filmography. And 2013, 2014 was a very kind of important time for Linklater as a filmmaker because he had Before Midnight in 2013, and then the year later he had Boyhood, which
Which
was his.
I have seen. I remember when that came out.
Yeah. And both of them were kind of like the culmination of incredibly ambitious projects that had spanned, decades for him at that time. So he was getting a lot of press and publicity. And while I don't read as much film criticism anymore, just because I kind of like to have my own, opinions as unfiltered, at the time I was following a few critics, and one of them, Drew McWeeny from HitFix, who I believe I had mentioned before, it also kind of prompted me to see The Witch. He did a review of Before Midnight, talking about not just that film, but the trilogy as a whole, and what kind of an artistic and cinematic achievement, unique achievement he thought it was. And that piece kind of inspired me to think, okay, I'm going to actually go and like seek these films out. And so I did. And I watched the first one, Before Sunrise, and I loved it. For so many reasons that we'll get into in detail. But I kind of gave myself a little bit of a breather with it, like, week or two. Then I did watch the second film, Before Sunset. Loved it even more. That's probably my favorite of the three, but I think all three of these movies are near perfect. And they all have near perfect endings, in my opinion. So those fears that you had mentioned earlier, I hope you'll find that they, the movies allay them. And then I watched Before Midnight, which I also adored. It's the one that I think might be actually the best crafted of the three, even though it's the one I might personally relate to the least, just because of the way these films are structured. They take place at, not only 9 years apart in our real world time, but 9 years apart within the characters' lives. And at the time I initially saw these films, I was kind of in between the Before Sunrise age, which was the early 20s for our main characters, Jesse and Céline, and then in the Before Sunset age, which is like the characters' early 30s, which I was kind of starting to relate to more. And the Before Midnight, I haven't quite gotten to that age and those characters' life experiences yet. But as I get older every year, I start to appreciate it more, even if it does deal with certain things that I have not yet experienced in my own life. So, but I think that individually, all these films are beautiful works of art, and collectively, they constitute one of my just favorite movie going experiences ever. And they are, as I said, very unique films. I think they are among the very best of this type of film. And I just feel like they've actually had an incredible influence on the way that I engage not only with cinematic art, but just life in general. Some of the perspectives offered here I find particularly resonant and powerful. And I truly feel like all three of these movies have made my life better. So I just love them so much and can't wait to talk about why. But my overwhelming takeaway is that these movies are special, and I will always treasure them no matter how old I get.
Yeah, I was sort of expecting this, but like you have an idea of what a movie is going to be, and then it was in line with that, but also I was still somewhat surprised by how minimalist the film is, in a way that reminded me a lot of the film Once, which is a film that I really love, though I haven't seen it in a while. That actually is a good reminder to go revisit that one. Um, uh, of course, this one feels like it probably even still, obviously, a lower budget film, feels like they had a higher budget for cameras and whatnot. Once is the kind of movie that really inspires you if you've got nothing but your little crappy video camera that you can go out and make a great movie. But no, I thought this was really beautifully done, and it sort of caught me off guard with how emotional I got by the end of the movie. Um, uh, and one of the things that I loved most about it is the film very just to give people like if you haven't seen a movie, the gist of the movie, you have these the two characters, Jesse and Céline, who are strangers. They meet on a train, and Jesse's about to head back home the next day. He's catching a flight, but then he asks her to. They have a long extended conversation on the train, and then he asks her in quite an audacious move for her to disembark the train and spend the next night with him, just walking around Vienna. And my first instinct upon this was like, "Are you crazy, girl? Don't do that." You have no idea what kind of psycho this guy might be.
I have an interesting anecdote about that from the making of the movie, but yes.
But everything works out okay. He's not a psychopath, but still, in general, people watching this movie, don't do that. It's a bad idea. So what transpires over the rest of the film is these two characters, spending the night in Vienna together, and walking through the city, and basically having discussions ranging from life, death, love, on all these different things, and it's really unlike any other uh, you know love story I've ever seen, in the way that it really does sort of convince you that over the course of not even 24 hours that these two characters just fall hopelessly in love with each other, and by the end it's like you're completely emotionally enraptured in a way that I wasn't expecting. And yeah, it's very beautiful. And but yeah, and one of the things that what I was getting to originally, why I wanted to explain a bit about the movie, is that the two characters are sort of set up initially as these sort of opposites, where she's the more romantic idealist and he's the cynical person. But in reality, as we see over the course of the movie, he's actually not a cynic at all. He's actually quite romantic, but he's wearing the cover of a cynic. Um, and he tries very hard to keep that exterior up, but I think both she and the audience are able to see through that, and so I thought that was great, and yeah, so I just thought it was a very beautiful film.
Yeah, it's I mentioned, I think during the last week when we were in the past couple of weeks when I was trying to like set up this movie knowing that we were going to talk about it, that as much as I absolutely adore these films, I sometimes find myself hesitating to recommend them to people because I can never quite guarantee if they'll be open to, as I say, being on its wavelength. Because these movies being kind of very much slice of life, conversational, like character interaction pieces. They are not your typical Hollywood movie, which is one of the reasons I'm honestly astonished that not only did this initial film get made, but all three of them got made, and that they were all financially successful and critically beloved. You know, it is a remarkable achievement just in that respect alone, even aside from its artistic, merits. But the big reason for that is, like, when you try to tell people, like, what is this movie about? It's a tricky question, because these movies are not what you would call traditionally plot heavy. And I could push back a little bit on that in the sense that, when people think about plot, they think about inciting incidents, conflict being, driving our characters forward, characters having to make difficult choices. And those are all like traditional elements of what constitutes a very, strong narrative. And this movie has those, but in much subtler ways. What it doesn't have, none of the movies do, is big, explosions, like life or death stakes, even though emotionally sometimes it can feel that way when you really start to resonate with what the characters are going through. And the world is not in danger, even though Céline sometimes may feel that it is. And it's really just the most fundamental construct of character conflict, of all, which is two different people trying to forge a connection and encountering, both things that help draw them towards the other person, and in some cases, push them a little bit away, but ultimately getting to know someone. That's really what these movies are about, or at least this first one. It, like, the idea of forging a connection with another human being in an opportunity born out of chance. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't fit in an easy log line for when you're trying to pitch or sell this movie to somebody, which is one of the reasons why, even when I first saw these movies, I'm like, that was just magic. It was alchemy. I don't really know how this movie got made. I don't care. I think the process might, undercut that for me. But eventually I did start to explore how these movies got made, and my admiration for them only grew, because these movies are very much crafted. Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy and Kim Krisian, who's credited as a co-writer on this first movie and as a story by on the second one, these movies are written. These are some of the best examples of like written movies I've ever seen, because even though they feel very improvisational, they're not. They talk about this extensively.
I actually I was about 25 minutes into the movie where I stopped to check the Wikipedia page to see if the film's dialogue had been improvised, because I was genuinely curious about that, and it's not. And hats off to them for making it feel that way.
Yeah, but the thing is, there was improvisation involved. It's just not the kind of improvisation that we typically think of as improvisation, as in, we're going to set these two people up in this situation, we're going to turn the camera on, and we're just going to let them riff and figure it out in real time. That process happened, but it happened off camera. One of the reasons that these movies feel so very like real, but also so impeccably well crafted, is because the actors, Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, went through that process. The writer, director Richard Linklater, and the co-writer Kim Krisian all participated in that process extensively and gave each other notes and feedback, and all brought themselves and their own perspective to the movie. And then they found what worked, and then they rehearsed it. And if something didn't work in the rehearsal, they would, do it again and kind of figure it out, but never in a way that made it feel like overly stilted, like they were trying to hit certain beats, in a way that made it feel like, okay, this is the authentic conversation that these two characters would have. So by the time they actually, shot the movie, and they knew the general outlines of, what the story was going to be, but they still had room to make it feel natural because it is their voices, in an unfiltered collaborative form. And that's one of the reasons that I just find the process behind these movies so fascinating and the on-screen results so emotionally compelling.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a couple moments throughout I was just talking about the fact that, you know, the part where she agrees to get off the train with him and me being like, no, be careful, girl. I had a similar feeling when she's relaying the story about the therapist and writing the story about killing the boyfriend, and at that point I'm like, oh no, dude, you're the one who should watch out. Not seriously, but
yeah.
And what's so funny is then, of course, later when they're having the back and forth on their imaginary phone calls with their friends, the fact that that comes back, and
yeah,
and she's like, he's probably terrified. And yeah, no, it's so I love that because stuff like that felt like the kind of rambling that you do when you're in that situation of talking to somebody that you're nervous to talk to, and you start spilling things out that you're like, why did I say that? and so, but that feels very real, versus being scripted, which is why I was curious if that had been the case. So it's really impressive that they got that across. And yeah, no, it was interesting just for a lot of them. A lot of the movie, see, I had very conflicted feelings about how I felt with, the two characters sort of moment to moment. I was like, there were moments when I had frustrations with Jesse because I'm like, dude, dial back the cynicism. She doesn't want to hear that. But then there'd be moments where obviously he was letting that wall down, and you get to really see what he's about. And then by the end of the movie, you're just like, you're so on board with these two, and just wanting them to be happy together. So yeah, it's especially with him. I was surprised at how I could simultaneously be really frustrated with him at various points, but still at the same time be really responding to his character.
And that's one of the many things that I find so compelling about these two characters specifically, because they are not, purely idealized characters. They're very real. They're very flawed. They have elements of them that I personally resonate with and identify deeply. And then there are elements of them where I kind of like push back a little bit because I'm like, that's not really the way my worldview works. So perhaps this is causing a little bit of friction, but all in a good way. And that is part of the collaborative process, because these actors, Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, had a critical role in shaping the characters. And if you've seen other performances by Ethan Hawke or Julie Delpy, you know that there's a lot of those actors themselves in these characters, but they are not the characters. They are, shaping the role. But you've mentioned a couple times the kind of the inciting incident, I would call, or at least the first big, let's say, twist of the movie, even though that might be a generous term, where after Céline and Jesse have made their connection on the train, prompted by that arguing German couple, and kind of forged their initial connection, we get.
Which, by the way, all I could think of was like, you two better shut the F up because they're both trying to read. But of course, that's the thing. If they had been left in peace to read their books, then they would have actually started talking to each other. But it's like, that is what I dread most in an experience like that, is like a quiet if I'm on a train and it's a quiet train, except for this one goddamn couple who won't stop arguing loudly, it's like, shut the F up. Sorry.
No,
But that really,
it's a very relatable thing, and like we've all had that experience of someone and their partner who start arguing in public, and you're just kind of like, you're really going to do this here where all of us can listen? Okay. Now, obviously, you know, as Céline kind of hints earlier, like when she sat down next to Jesse, she did so on purpose. So like clearly they'd had at least a little bit of a spark before then, but the inciting incident happens. They start talking to one another, kind of clearly forging a connection. But then we arrive at our first big, you know, crossroads where the train stops where Jesse is supposed to get off in Vienna, and Céline is supposed to continue on, I believe, to Paris. And you know, in real life, for 99% of us, you know, this would be the end of that interaction. It was like, okay, well, now we're gonna, like, we have this connection, but shoot, we'll part ways. Maybe now in real life, you know, you might have asked her for her number, and they would try to, you know, reconnect that way, and maybe it would have lasted, maybe it would have faded out. But the reason that this movie kind of takes a turn into what some might consider a more fantastical element, but is actually very much a real world kind of grounding element, is Jesse kind of takes a big leap, and he asks Céline to get off the train with him. And she ultimately agrees. And when you mentioned like what it is that Jesse says to her to get her off the train, you know, if she ever even would. You know, this was an element that Richard Linklater and company had kind of developed in the screenplay. Like, okay, these two characters are going to have a connection. They're going to, you know, the train's going to stop. He's going to ask her to get off the train with him. And Richard Linklater had something else written. And I don't remember what that was. I don't even think it's really come out that much. But Julie Delpy, the actress, was basically like, I wouldn't get off the train with a guy if he said this to me. So they started to workshop it. Like I said, they kind of started to have that collaborative process of what it would be that, like, when you have an authentic connection with somebody that you want to continue, but you're in kind of an uncertain place, what would it be that for you, Julie, as the actress, and Céline as your character, that would actually get you to take this leap? And the idea that they ended up settling on, kind of inspired by her, you know, putting it out there and them workshopping it, was the idea that's in the movie, the idea of the time travel. And so when Jesse is making that speech, you know, that kind of speech about, you know, picture this as time travel, you know, when you're 40 years down the line, married to some guy that you're kind of not really, you know, having that spark anymore. And you're thinking back to all the other people you met in your life and what would have happened if you'd taken up with one of them. I'm one of those guys. That's me. You know, this is your chance to kind of see how that could have worked out. And, you know, and it seems a little bit corny in the moment because it is, but it's comes from a genuine place. And it's these two actors who are like, that's an interesting idea. Let's go with that. And while not every person is going to, in the real world, is going to respond to something like that, these two characters who are, as you know, that are very kind of idealistic and have a little bit of fanciful, you know, quality to them at times, and also, you know, romantic ideals, you know, that's the idea that sparks for them. And that's why she gets off the train with him. And obviously, this being a very like happy, if somewhat bittersweet romantic movie, it's not the story of, you know, what's happening when this beautiful young woman gets talked off the train by this stranger. It's, you know, there's no ill intent here. These characters are actually sincere. And if you're a cynic by nature, you're going to be like, well, that would never happen. But if you're open to it, if you're like, okay, I'm willing to roll with this and see what connection these characters actually develop, then you get the rest of the story.
Which fits in very nicely with the sort of ethos of the movie of, you know, cynical versus romantic. But still, I couldn't help but see, like, there was a version of this movie that shows them walking off the train and then cuts to a news report and being like, murder in Vienna. But yeah, no, it's so you're either on board with it or you're not, and yeah, no, the part that I found less believable was later when he basically talked to the bartender into giving them the bottle of wine. I was like, no freaking way.
I agree. That's probably the most fanciful, moment in the entire movie. Definitely wouldn't happen in America, but who knows? Maybe Viennese bartenders are a little bit more laissez-faire. But it's also like I tried to put myself in that guy's shoes of like, if a young couple walked in and they were clearly like having a great time and being like very much in love and authentic, would I want to help them out? I would want to help them out, but would I do it at the expense of risking my job? Perhaps not, but again, maybe they have different labor laws over there.
But yeah, no, I had I had a good chuckle at that one because I was like, nope, not gonna happen. But that's fine. We're already in fantasy land with the movie, so I'm like, oh, just let it, just let that play out. No, yeah, and I did feel bad. I'm jumping all over the place because really this movie is just about like different moments and different encounters. So
yeah.
But I felt bad for the two guys with their play. I'm like, they probably got all excited and they were telling people, somebody's actually coming to our play. and then no shows.
Yeah. It's a moment of like pure comedy early in the movie, and then it actually becomes a little bit bittersweet by the end because you feel bad for those two guys and their production of Bring Me the Horns of Wilmington's Cow, but also because it's very much the clock running out on this magical night that Jesse and Céline have shared when because we forget about it too. Like we're so wrapped up in their, storyline.
I didn't forget about it. Yeah. I'm like, they're not going to that play.
Oh,
I feel really bad for those guys.
Well, the thing is, I forgot about it. So perhaps you're a better person than me on that front. But I just when Jesse brings it up, kind of an amusing thing. It's like, hey, guess what? We didn't go to those guys' play. It's like I was like, oh, for them. But then I was also like, oh no, they're back in real time now. The magic is running clocks and it's about to strike midnight
but also I feel like they said we'll try to make it, which translates to not gonna happen, dudes.
Yeah.
And it's like they've got their one night together, like they're not gonna be spending any of that time at some play about a cow.
A cow with a disease who smokes cigarettes with her hose. That's I got to admit, I am intrigued. If they ever did like a digital short of Bring Me the Horns of Wilmington's Cow, I would watch it, but I don't think it needed to be in this movie.
Yeah, because it's one of those things like, maybe this doesn't deserve that much discussion, but
it's funny.
I thought about this. I did. I was thinking about this at various points during the movie. And I was like, realistically though, if you've decided that you're gonna, spend the night with this, person you've just met and it's got, and it's clearly got, romantic overtones and all that, you're not gonna put yourself in a position where you're just sitting there for like an hour or two not talking to each other looking at this stupid cow play. It's like and so, you're not going to waste that time. You're instead going to stay focused on the other person. So completely understandable that they didn't go. I still feel bad for the guys, but yeah.
No, I think by the time that they had like had their romantic kiss on top of the Ferris wheel, their all thoughts of the play had faded by that point.
Which and that was like and if you're really paying attention, it's the story on the train about him seeing his grandmother.
Yeah.
That really gives you your first insight into how Jesse actually views the world. But if that sort of slips under your radar, then it is the the moment up in the tower, with the kiss, and then the immediately after, which she calls him out on immediately afterwards, reverting back to trying to put himself up as a cynic, and it's like, you're full of shit, dude.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And the thing is, we all know people like that. I sometimes, like, when I was younger, I had that same idea of, like, I don't want people to know that, like, I respond to these, like, idealistic romantic ideas, so I'm going to put on a more cynical veneer and maybe disguise it with a little bit of a pseudo intellectual, like, posturing in that kind of way. And so that, that can resonate with some people, and for some people they just see right through it. So, and in this, and the thing about it is that Jesse himself knows that he's kind of putting up that front. When he talks later in the movie about the fact that, when they're having that fake phone conversation in the restaurant, and he talks about, I was so unsure of myself, I thought everything I said sounded so stupid. And the moment, like, when they're lying in the park, and he talks about, like, when I get a little nervous, I tell the same pseudo intellectual story. See, I've heard all those stories, so of course I'm sick of myself. But we also get the moments where you can see, as you pointed out, that he actually is longing for that connection and that sense of authenticity. And that's one of the reasons why he wins Céline over, because moments like the one you mentioned, when he's talking to her about his grandmother, and seeing her after her death, in the yard through the fountain hose that he's playing with, like, that's not the kind of story that you tell somebody when you're trying to impress them with how, like, smart you are. You're relating a story, that experience that happened to you when you were 3 or 4 years old. That's like a pure, like, emotional memory, and he's telling her that because he feels a connection to her. And that's really what, as she says, that's the moment she really kind of falls for him. And then that is the true Jesse. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, by the way, I neglected to say hi to some other arrivals that we've had. Hi, Pedar, Wheezy, and Danny. Welcome, guys. Thank you all for showing up. And yeah, and it's funny because I feel like as the movie goes on, he does get a little smarter, and because it's because first there's two moments where he's very cynical about things that, like, other people they encounter, something they're doing. First, it's the palm reader, which I feel is, in my personal opinion, is justified. But still, like, you can tell that, she even says she didn't like when, he was, all cynical about that. And then they run into the poet, and he's immediately then cynical about the poet as well. And it's like, dude, you just got done with this fight. So I feel like I'm like, don't blow it, dude. Press the brakes a little bit. But then not soon after, there's a conversation they have, and you'll have to excuse me because I have only seen the movie one time,
Yeah.
but I forget what the actual topic of the conversation was, but it's when they're sitting on the bench in the alleyway.
Which is my favorite scene in the entire movie.
And she's talking about something very like related to love and romance. I think you'd be able to better sum up what they were discussing in that scene. But I remember thinking that, like, at first I was thinking, like, when I hadn't yet realized how much of like what he was putting up was just a front, you know, that he recognizes recognizes that that's not a moment for his sort of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, snide cynicism, but that's also, but then when you examine the character closer, you see that, you know, that's when he's letting his guard down as well. So I really liked that moment. Um, and yeah, so that's, and that goes back to what I was talking earlier about, that sort of back and forth, you know, feelings toward, you know, his character of like, um, being sort of, um, you know, both being frustrated with him at times, and then like, but understanding what's sort of going on in his head, and so when moments like that happen, you know, it's like, there you
Yeah. Yeah, and it's they're moments of natural connection that draw those, you know, that side of him out. And you know, one of the things about that's kind of the authentic nature of these, you know, the conversations that Jesse and Céline have in this movie is, you know, it's sometimes hard just to sit in a moment, especially when you're like feeling connected to and attracted to another person. You know, it really takes a lot of, you know, both self-assuredness and like like certainty in the strength of your connection to actually just sit there and appreciate the fact that you're both in the moment. You're going to feel a little bit awkward about it. And we see that one of the ways that Jesse kind of compensates for that is, you know, he'll start telling another story, you know, like, and
go.
because, and it's such a natural thing when you're like, you can see like, oh, like there's something really happening here, but we don't really know what to say next. So I'm just going to say something kind of light and off the cuff and humorous and kind of try to like break the tension, even if it may not be the exact right thing to say in this moment. That's kind of like when they're having that moment in the church. And then he kind of brings up the story about his buddy who does, like, after he shared this absolutely beautiful story about like the Quaker wedding, then he brings up the story about his buddy, the atheist, who denied a homeless guy $100 because he gave him the wrong answer. And you know, Celine's like, that's mean. And he's like, yeah, it is. And like that's not the kind of story that he knew that like she wasn't necessarily going to respond to. He shared that story because he's kind of like, I want to say something here that will, you know, allow us to laugh a little bit. And he does that throughout the movie. Céline kind of has a different response to those moments. Céline seems a little bit more comfortable with the silence. She's clearly still feeling the you know, the kind of the tension of like the attraction and the uncertainty about what to say next, but she isn't as keen on like breaking that silence. She will, like, when she gets passionate about something, but the moments when they actually choose to talk and the moments when they don't have anything, you know, pertinent to say to each other right in that moment, those are some of the most fascinating moments in the entire movie. And it's why that scene, which we'll circle back to in the alleyway, which I mentioned is my favorite scene for reasons we'll discuss, but also one of my other favorite scenes in the movie is the moment where they say nothing at all, which is the scene in the listening booth in the
I
record
was
store.
just going to bring that up. Great minds think alike.
Yes.
That's one of my absolute favorite moments in
Yeah.
the movie, because it's just like there's so much tension building up underneath that, and it's like, it's just letting that sort of simmer, you know, right there, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, and set to an absolutely beautiful song, "Come Here" by Kath Bloom. It's one of the most beloved scenes in the movie for a reason, and also again because it's one of those moments that everybody, or almost everybody, I won't assume everybody, but almost everybody can relate to, because almost everybody has had a moment like that where you have a connection with somebody and you don't know quite what to say, particularly if it's a romantic connection. I've definitely experienced this in my own life, where you know that you like this person, you think that the other person likes you, and you find yourself alone with them, and you want to talk to them further, you want to say something to them. Sometimes you just want to like look at them, but you don't want to make it weird. So you kind of like sneak a glance at them, and then you look away because you don't want to catch them to catch you looking. And then you like sneak a glance again, and this time you see that they're actually looking at you too, and you're like, so you look away, but then you're like, should I have looked away? Maybe I should look back. Then you look back and you see that they look back, and then they just looked away. And like, I'm like, just like, I have lived this moment. and it's like, and not in the same context as these two characters, but it's just such a natural human reaction. And it's the kind of thing that, like, when you read it in the script, like, it is getting at this general idea, but this is a case of performance, because as well written as these movies are, they're also phenomenally well acted. And Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy in that moment just know exactly what to do, and how long to let their gaze linger, and when to look away, and when to bite their lip, and when to kind of like give a little smile and shrug their shoulders. And it's like, just, I don't remember exactly how long the scene is, like maybe like a minute or two, but it feels like an eternity in that moment, because so much is happening there. And it's, as you say, it's a beautiful, just cinematic piece of filmmaking there.
And there's also like something added to it, just because of there's, especially now that we're like almost 30 years removed from when this movie was made, there's something incredibly nostalgic about this situation as well, because it's in a music store with a listening booth, and it's light, and you know, a lot of young people watching this movie today won't have any context for that whatsoever. It's like, this is a situation that none of them will ever, and may never find themselves in, because what, you went somewhere to get music? And having these sort of in-person moments like this, so it feels very nostalgic in that way, and that adds to the romance of it. And yeah, no, I just loved it, because it was a moment of just, it's, you know, it's the very nature of cinema. It's a moment that's driven by the visual performances of the actors, as well as the sound with the music, and you know, and it's a moment that, as you said, it can be like, the moment can be scripted, but it's all entirely up to what the actors are doing in the moment. And so that's what's so beautiful about it, is it's, you know, it's pure cinema in that moment. Uh and it's the spontaneity of what's going on between the two people on screen.
Yeah, and what's happening on screen is spontaneous, and that's why it feels authentic. But it's also like an immensely well directed and crafted and staged scene. Like, you know, Richard Linklater's choice as the director to just let the camera linger on them in a one long take there, and the cinematography choice by Lee Daniel to kind of frame it from like a slightly like lower angle. Like, I don't know why, but that just, for whatever reason, makes the scene better to me, because it just makes it feel ever so slightly off, but also more natural. And and then just the choice to, as you say, pair it with that music and that song in particular, like, all of that was artistic craftsmanship, but it wouldn't work if Julie Delpy and Ethan Hawke didn't have like a very real connection in that moment, because it entirely depends on the chemistry that these two actors have with each other. And as this trilogy goes on, like, obviously they become incredibly familiar and more comfortable with each other. But like, at this point in the timeline, they have done a lot of rehearsal, but like, they're very young actors at this stage. it's a remarkably mature performance in that moment to not feel the need to over emote and just kind of trust that the audience is going to, you know, understand what's happening
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm trying to. I'm more than happy to let you guide the conversation if you want, since you've seen it more times than I have. But yeah, it's yeah. I'm trying to think where to go next with it.
Well, just to kind of, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, so I was just going to say, like, so this is the kind of movie that you can't really spoil. It's kind of hard to follow like the plot because really it is driven by emotion and theme and the subjects of the discussion. And it's not like, even though the movie itself takes place in like a compact area of linear time, like it's not necessarily where it's following like a very strict linear progression in terms of the narrative. Like we will like kind of skip over certain beats and we'll catch up with the characters a little bit further down the line. But this particular section of the movie I found really fascinating because we had talked about the early connection that the characters have on the train, and then the critical choice that Jesse offering to Céline to, you know, to get off the train with them and check out Vienna and continue their conversation. And then they do that. And then right after that, there's a moment of awkwardness because they're like, okay, we did this. Now what are we going to do? And that's when they have the encounter with the two Austrian German guys who tell them about their play. And that's kind of a case of Jesse and Céline trying to break the tension. Like, oh, let's go check some things out. Let's check out the town. Oh, everything's closing. Shoot, what are we going to do now? But the scene where I really feel like the movie actually kicks into pure like flow, and like the conversation once it gets going there never really like stops until the end, is the subsequent scene before the record store where they're on the tram or the bus, and because that is an area where, you know, that's another long take you'll see. Like that is a case of the actors, you know, they get on the tram, they sit in the back, and the camera just kind of fixates on them. And that's when Jesse kind of has again, a little bit like, you could say cliched, but like it's honestly feels very authentic to his character and hers when he's like, okay, now we're going to play like question time. And and then they start like you know,
Okay, when he made what I call the dick move of his one-word response after she's told him a lot of personal stuff, which I thought was hilarious.
No, and it is hilarious because you can see here that like, and she calls him on it, and that's one of the things that gets him to open up, because he asks her what could be construed as a little bit more of a, you know, fascinating, you know, like not fascinating, I should say, like more just like lighthearted questions, like describe for me your first sexual feelings towards another person in a weird, funny voice, and it makes her laugh. And then she relates the story about the attraction she had to this guy at swimming camp or something, and he, you know, and he kind of laughs and kind of takes the piss out of her a little bit. And then she asks him the very much more authentic, real question. And as you can say, he kind of clams up and tries to laugh it off. And we learn later kind of why. It's because he's getting over a heartbreak where he was just broken up with, which is part of the reason he's a little cynical right now. But when she presses him on it, when she challenges him on it, then he actually starts to say something a little bit more interesting, which is his idea of like, what actually do you mean when you say that you've been in love with somebody? And he says like, yes, I have told somebody that I love them and I meant it. But was it actually a very like selfless giving kind of love, or was it something else? And that actually is a very interesting question for him to propose, because that that's another thing that's relatable. It's like people tell each other that they love each other all the time. Do they actually mean it in that sincere way? To actually like know that you were in love with someone in that way, that it, it's understandable that at this young age they may not have felt that connection with it. And the fact that he recognizes that, she understands that, and that actually forges a real moment of emotional connection between them. And then they start talking about, other ideas about, when he asks her, like, what's something that really pisses you off? And she goes in, that's when she starts to get excited and passionate. And she lists off a lot of things that actually do sound very, very annoying. And you're like, yeah, you're probably right to be pissed off about this kind of stuff. But he actually just kind of like sits there, and you can see that he's like listening to her. And it's around this time when like she's getting very animated, and he's looking at her, and he kind of like reaches out and to like brush a lock of hair away from her face, and then she turns back to him, and he like pulls his hand away, a moment that comes back later in the movie when she does it to him. But it's like, and you can see that like he is interested in what she's saying. And then when she gets her chance and she turns to him and asks him the question, like, so what's a problem for you? And just out of complete, he probably barely even realizes he said it. He's like, you probably. And then she says, what? But not in a like challenging way, but like a kind of like, I'm sorry, what did you say? Because clearly that was something he didn't mean to say. He's basically like recognizing this moment, oh, I'm feeling something here. I'm falling for this woman right here. And then he goes off on one of his more like pseudo-intellectual stories about the idea of reincarnation and fragmented souls. And does this mean that like if every soul was actually like a 1/50,000th of an original soul, is that why we're all so scattered? And that's just more like funny, even though it's a fun thing to think about. But that moment where he's just like what's a problem for you? You probably. That is him actually like recognizing like, oh no, like I'm actually feeling something here. And it breaks down doors. Like the next scene is them in the record shop, and then that's when you can see that like they're actually very attracted to each other and very interested in keeping this connection going. And from then on, their conversation really proceeds uninterrupted throughout the rest of the movie.
Which is like, I guess, we have talked about this, but it's just one of the really unique things about this movie that you don't get to see that often, is just the fact that this movie essentially is just two people talking about things for its entire duration, and just the fact that it's so emotionally compelling. It's really impressive.
Yeah,
because you don't see that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there are other movies that are in a similar genre of like a day in the life kind of connection between two strangers who find something, and the movie kind of just explores their connection. And throughout its runtime, you had mentioned Once, that's a good example of that. But what I find so fascinating about these movies in particular is something that is present throughout all three, which is this movie feels more immediate, and it feels more urgent, and it feels more like raw and conflicted, because they're up against the clock. There is an actual unseen, spoken like adversary here that they're fighting against invisibly, which is time. They don't have unlimited time here. In the morning, this is going to end, and they don't know when it will resume, if it ever will. But the fact that all these movies, all three of them, deal with time in this way. And they deal with it in slightly differently, but this one in particular, there's a hard stop, a hard date of like tomorrow morning. Celine's going to have to get back on the train. Jesse's going to have to catch his flight, and we don't know if they're ever going to see each other again. So it's not exactly clear, maybe like 8 hours, 12 hours. And obviously the movie doesn't show us all that time, but it shows us that they are committed to spending the entire time together. And that gives us, because we know that this has to end, we are really, we start to feel it once we get towards the end and we realize that, like, oh, these characters actually don't have forever, even though they're like talking and being, you know, very at ease with one another. They are feeling the pressure, and we start to feel the pressure too. And you don't feel it as much in this early section, because this is the kind of like the early, you know, they're it's still, the night is still young and they're still, like, you know, feeling each other out. But as their connection deepens and the time grows short, that's where the stakes start to feel high, and that's where the emotion, like, really, you know, ramps up. And there's that moment later in the movie when, you know, they're kind of sitting on that balcony overlooking the city, and, you know, Céline brings up the allusion to Cinderella, and she's like, I think at this point you're supposed to produce the glass slipper and see if it fits. And Jesse, in a very actually real and like authentic moment there, without any cynicism, just kind of, you know, brushes a lock of hair from her face and says, it'll fit. And then he kisses her, and then the movie proceeds. But it's, you know, it's not quite midnight, although, you know, Before Midnight will be the third movie in this trilogy. But it, you know, that these characters are reckoning with time, and that's something that Richard Linklater has talked about extensively, about using time in that way to actually introduce conflict into this movie that otherwise might feel a little bit just, you know, like slice and day in the life in that kind of way.
Yeah. Oh, and that actually is a good place to pause for a moment. Let's do the mid roll. We actually, I meant to bring this up off the top of the stream, but we're changing our schedule a little bit because next week we've decided to take the week off because you got something going on, so you might not be able to either make it or spend as much time as we would like. So we're actually going to push our Bad Batch finale discussion to the next Sunday, which will be the 12th.
Yeah.
So that's when we'll be back. And then the week after that, we have our anniversary discussion of the Phantom Menace scheduled. And then we're going to kind of talk about what we do scheduling wise from there. And so it worked out good because, as I told you, we've been going for a good number of weeks straight now, and so I was feeling, you know, the urge for taking a week off. So it works out good. So we won't be streaming next Sunday, but the Sunday after that we'll be back. And I'm really looking forward to when we do come back, that discussion about the Bad Batch, as we discussed earlier. It's, you know, talking about the pressures of time. That's an instance where I'm feeling it, like, you know, we spoke earlier about the fact that we aren't quite sure, like, how much we're getting for that final episode. And so I have different expectations, like, depending on how long that final episode is. And it's funny, like, and even if it is a longer one, there's a lot of stuff that I feel like I've had to let go of hope wise for what we were going to see. There were characters that I hoped to see this, you know, return to the show this season that I no longer expect to see, and it's a very different trajectory than I was expecting for this show. But this show has constantly defied expectations. It's like I remember last year when I had this, you know, whole image in my head of what the season 2 finale was going to be, and I thought it was going to be this big, huge mission to save Crosshair, and then it horribly turned into tragedy with the loss of Tech, and we were just like devastated. And so who knows what we're gonna get for the finale here, if it's going to be a big old tragedy or if we're going to. But I do expect to still be left with some hope, even if there is a lot of tragedy, because this is Star Wars, and even when Star Wars goes like really dark, like say in Andor, there's still hope. So. So yeah, and it's going to be a lot of Star Wars the next couple of weeks, because shortly after the finale of the Bad Batch, we're getting both the Phantom Menace coming back out in the theaters, and also we're getting Tales of the Empire. Releasing on May the 4th, and we'll probably fit some time into our Bad Batch stream for discussion on that, because I can't wait to see that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of fun Star Wars content coming up.
Yeah, and other stuff too, but just the way it worked out, we were originally going to do our discussion of the Bad Batch this next Sunday, May 5th, the day after May the 4th, and it just life stuff has gotten in the way of that, mostly on my end, but also, as John alluded to, basically since we returned after our break at the end of 2023 and had our first stream in January, we've gone for now 4 straight months with a stream every week. And, naturally we're just feeling a little bit like, what, maybe it might be nice to take a week off. Not that we don't love doing these discussions, but, everyone deserves to, sometimes just have a weekend to themselves. So, and
sometimes you want to go into the weekend and be like, all right, I don't have anything to do. I can just relax.
Yeah, and I actually think it's a good weekend for it, because as you alluded to, we're going to get the Bad Batch on this Wednesday, May 1st. It'll be a very busy weekend with, the Phantom Menace returning to theaters on that May the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and then Tales of the Empire. So it's actually going to be nice that we'll actually have a week or more to sit with the end of the Bad Batch and kind of process it, rewatch it several more times, and then still have our conversation, but be able to do it in a little bit more of a relaxed way. And I'm actually hopeful that if we, given like that little extra 11-day buffer, maybe, no guarantees, but just maybe, after the Bad Batch ends and we see what, where they lead these characters, they might announce what's coming next, in terms of the next animated show. I don't know. I have no inside intel on that whatsoever, but I hope.
Oh, really? Because I took that as you have the inside track on this, Jared.
I know all when it comes to this stuff.
You've got your sources. So people should take to Twitter and start asking you all the questions. No, and honestly, and it'll be nice just to have the week off without worrying about doing anything for the weekend, because also, in addition to all the Star Wars stuff coming up this week, I'm also going to be going to the movies a lot, because there are a couple different movies back out in the theaters. Currently, Alien is in theaters. I'm planning to go see that tomorrow. And then I might just go back the next day, because The Mummy is also out in theaters. And they've been doing that a lot. Like a couple weeks ago, the Matrix was out. Although I didn't go see that because we all had our watch party. And it felt like that was a good enough experience. And then in a couple weeks, Lord of the Rings is coming back out in the theaters. Haven't decided on that one yet, because it's going to be the extended versions. And even as much as I love those movies, it's a bit of a challenge sitting in the theater for 3.5 to 4 hours per movie. So that'll be. I'll have to decide whether I want to do that in theaters or just do my own personal screenings at home, where I can take breaks.
Yeah, I don't feel like the urgency, even for a movie I love as much as Lord of the Rings. Like, it's always a joy to be able to see it again in theaters. Likewise for Alien. But you do have to pick your battles sometimes. And the only one that I've committed to going and watching in theaters again is The Phantom Menace, just because, it's it's a particularly special movie and a particularly special anniversary for that one, with it being
Well, and also contrary to what a lot of like online news sites have been reporting, and of course we know they're never wrong. This is not the very first time the extended cuts of Lord of the Rings have been released in the cinemas. They've actually been released multiple times. Fellowship and Two Towers were released all the way back in 2003, and I know for a fact that Return of the King has made its way in the extended form in the theaters multiple times over the years because I've gone to see it. But those sites are gonna do their thing. So that's why I don't feel as much urgency for that. But I am planning. I've never seen Alien on the big screen, and I haven't gotten to see The Mummy in theaters since it was out in 1999 when it originally came out, and that's one of those special experiences that I remember because it was very different from what I was expecting going in. I heard I didn't really want to go see it. I think I went to go see it with one of my friends, and it was called The Mummy, so I was expecting like more of a horror film. And we all know I'm not super crazy about horror movies. And then lo and behold, it turned out to be more like an Indiana Jones movie, and I was like, "This is awesome!" So I may make it out for that one, and definitely the Phantom Menace I'll be seeing. And then I think there's a couple more things coming out later this year, and I think this year I'm finally going to be doing a bunch of the Studio Ghibli screenings, which I've kept saying every year that I've wanted to do them, but then I always miss the start of them, and then I'm like, oh, I'll just watch them on Blu-ray. But there's still a number of them I haven't seen, so I feel like on the big screen would be a nice way to experience them for the first time. Oh, thank you, Laura, for popping in.
Yeah, thank you so much. Glad you could stop by.
Yeah. So and and I'm perfectly well aware that probably the reason why a lot of the studios are doing this is because they don't have as much to put out in theaters because of some strikes that happened last year. But I say do this all the time because I love going to see classics in theaters.
Yeah, it's a joy, and particularly if there is a special connection or anniversary. Like last year, I went to go see Return of the Jedi for its 40th anniversary in the theater, and 1999 being such a celebrated movie year, there are a lot of 25th anniversaries that are, and then Alien, it was the 45th anniversary. And they're doing that probably because Alien Romulus is going to be coming out later this year, but they just wanted to time it for 4/26, aka Alien Day. But it's I do look forward to starting to get back into the swing of going more into the movies a little bit more, because it used to be one of my favorite things to do. I've gotten away with it a little bit since I've made a couple life adjustments, but there's nothing like an old favorite to draw you back in. So
I think one of my favorite experiences with one of these types of things was about, I guess now it was probably at least about 10 years ago. It's I'm sorry to always go on about the passage of time, but it is freaky how
it's apt.
Yeah. But I remember when I went to go see Gladiator for an anniversary when it came back out in the theaters, and it was so weird how it felt like all of a sudden like I was 16 years old again, sitting in the theater seeing it that first time. There really is something special about going to see those old favorites. It's great seeing movies that you didn't get a chance to see in theaters, but there's also some really cool time travel thing that happens when you get to go see something that you saw originally in theaters like 20 years ago. It's it's really special, and and that's part of why I do want to make sure I go and see The Mummy this week, because I feel like I'll have a similar experience.
Yeah,
awesome. And it's just so many great movies, and I am going to be a little selective with them because it does cost a penny to a bit more than a penny to go see them, but still, it's with the very special ones, I want to make sure that I go ahead and check them out.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I will say that I haven't been to the Irish Film Institute, but I know that when I went to London back in, I want to say 2009, I did go to the British Film Institute, and and just to see the kind of stuff they showed there, I got to go to a screening of Jason and the Argonauts, which was followed up by a Q&A. It was either followed up or it might have been before. It preceded by a Q&A with Ray Harryhausen himself. And I had a seat like right in the front row, and I'll never forget that. And even though he wasn't signing autographs, but they had a book of like a lot of his work in like the bookstore that was part of the Institute, and he had signed the book. So in my mind, I got it signed by him. It's all close enough so that that's the history that I write in for that event. So I consider myself very lucky to have gotten to attend that screening and see him while he was still alive. So, but what I thought about when I went there, I was just like, I wish there was stuff around me like this in the States, where you could just go and see classic movies all the time.
Yeah,
because there's so many great pieces of cinema, that deserve to be seen on the big screen, and it's just, it's hard when you live in a little city in Southwest Florida, and you're at the mercy of just whenever the studios decide to put out some of the more mainstream classics every once in a while. And so I feel like this year feels very special because the studios are doing a lot of it, and so I want to take advantage.
Yep. As you should, and as like we always hope that we would have the opportunity to do. Sometimes it just doesn't make economic sense for them to do a wide release, and these things are like big city focused like New York or LA. But when they do put a movie out wide release, especially for a big anniversary, and you can make it work, nothing beats seeing these beloved classics in the theater. So glad we're going to have an opportunity to do that with The Phantom Menace, and we'll see what else comes along down the line. And it's a perfect lead into the fact that we'll be talking about the 25th anniversary of The Phantom Menace on May 19th. Its original release date that year. We obviously have both seen the movie enough. We could have talked about it anyway, but being able to see it in theaters one more time before we do that is going to be
fun. And also, it's funny that even the prequels are sort of subject to, only being available in later special edition releases, because the Phantom Menace had some things done to it. I'm not saying that I've partook in any such thing. Certainly not. I never would. But it has been made known to me that there are ways on the internet of getting copies of some of these films in their original form. Again, I have not partook in this myself, but I'm saying if you did, that would be a good way to celebrate the 25th anniversary. Imagine that. Um, but modified or not, I will still be enjoying it on the big screen, next week. And yeah, I saw that so many times in the theater when it came out. I'm trying to remember exactly how many times, probably about 8 or 9 times, which was a lot for, for being, I think I was 14 years old, 14 or 15 at the time. And yeah, I just I remember just having to go through the process of seeing all of the same movie trailers for every screening that I went to, and then looking forward to when that 20th Century Fox logo, finally hit. And yeah, it's so I'm going to really enjoy this experience. All right. So we had quite the mid-roll there. Let's dive back into the movie. So, let's see, because we were talking about when they were on the that moment where they were on the bridge, but we're kind of jumping around.
Yeah, so maybe one place we could go to is kind of, as they progress and as they're starting to have their like more seamless conversation, they do have a couple moments of conflict, like that start to emerge a little bit in that scene that you alluded to with the palm reader, and then with the very interesting Viennese bum, as Jesse puts it, the homeless poet who writes them the poem "Delusion Angel." Or
his reaction to their chosen word of milkshake had me dying. He was like, "Milkshake? No, okay."
Yeah, it's a great little bit. Like, for one thing, it's a beautiful, like you're obviously like you're very impressed that this guy was able to come up with that, even if he probably didn't write it in that exact moment as they alluded to. But it does spark a little bit of conflict in the earlier scene because, as you mentioned, there is a little bit of the tension between Jesse's kind of underlying insecurity about the whole concept of being open with his emotions to this extent, having just come off a breakup, and Céline being in this position where, as we kind of get the sense, she's still a student. She's a little bit adrift because she has also just come out of a long relationship under different circumstances, but she's more open to what's happening because she's made this big leap of agreeing to get off the train with Jesse. And as she tells him later in the park, like, you can't imagine why a night like this is so important to my life right now. You get the sense that this is something that she would not ordinarily be doing, but she's allowing herself to be in the moment in this way. And that is it. And she's allowing herself to enjoy those kind of romantic illusions in that way. Like when the palm reader tells her all those things about, her being on a journey and, becoming a very strong, independent woman. Obviously, she's very, enamored with that idea. But then the palm reader also says something a little bit, more grounded to her, which is probably the most important thing in that sequence, which is you need to resign yourself to the awkwardness of life. Which I love that little moment because that's also obvious throughout this entire movie is those little moments of awkwardness. Not everything is perfect. Not everything is going to be a fairy tale in that way. But being okay with that, learning to be okay with that, is a journey that both of these characters go on. And sometimes the characters they meet along the way kind of help them along that way. And when they encounter the poet a little bit later, he kind of breaks up what Jesse is determining their first real fight, even though it's still very playful and flirtatious, because she asks him the classic question, if we were together always, what would be the one thing that you that I would be doing that would always make you piss you off? And he's like, oh nope, I recognize this question, this is a trap. But then he tries to kind of turn it around on him, and that's when she has the delightful moniker of teasingly calling him a rooster prick, which I just thought was hilarious. And when the poet asked them for the word, and Céline's like, milkshakes, and Jesse's like, sure, milkshakes. I was going to say rooster prick, but sure, milkshakes. I can't imagine how the poet would have worked rooster prick into that poem, but he clearly would have risen to the challenge. But the poem itself is an absolute, like, beautiful and obviously very thematic resonance about its, what's going on with between the characters. It is a real poem. Was not a pre-existing poem. It was written for this movie by a poet named David Jewell. But when you read the lyrics, I'll just dash it off quickly, about like daydream delusion, limousine eyelash, oh baby with your pretty face, drop a tear in my wine glass, look at those big eyes, see what you mean to me, sweet cakes and milkshakes, I'm a delusion angel, I'm a fantasy parade. Like, that's all that kind of stuff where it's beautiful lyricism, but it's also like very kind of conventional in the sense of it's just kind of sweet romantic platitudes up to that point. But then it really gets into the heart of it, where the poem continues, I want you to know what I think, don't want you to guess anymore. You have no idea where I came from. You have no idea where we're going. Lodged in life like branches in the river, flowing downstream, caught in the current. I'll carry you, you'll carry me. That's how it could be. Don't you know me? Don't you know me by now? And obviously that, in addition to just being a beautiful poem, is very much the story of the movie. And sometimes we need to have that kind of a little bit of like metatextual narrative placed in front of us to, even if it is a bit on the nose, help us to understand exactly what it is that the movie is doing here. And it kind of smooths over their conflict in a moment, because you can see that Jesse himself is very much like, yeah, that's what's happening here. That's real. And he tries to make a joke about it, like the fact that the poet probably didn't just write that right away. You can tell he's moved, and Céline is clearly very enraptured by it. And that kind of is the part of the night where the things really start to even escalate further in terms of just the romantic connection, but also the sense of urgency that carries through the rest of the movie.
Yeah, no, although that was the moment when he tries to make a smart-ass comment about how I was like, no, this is the time for you to shut your mouth. Oh, God. But, yeah, no, that's been, and like, as for whether he, wrote that all in the moment or, or not, I'm one of the suckers who would have just, been like, no, he wrote the whole thing just then. Yeah. And so, yeah, no, I had the more romantic, optimistic view of that. And so my response to Jesse was like, oh, shut up.
And I like that the movie doesn't give us an answer on that front. It lets us just kind of, lets us believe what we want to believe. And clearly, Céline wants to believe he created that in the moment. Jesse probably thinks he, wrote it before and just plugged the word in. For this movie's purposes, it doesn't really matter. It tells us something about ourselves, what we think about what he did, and which character's perspective we're a little bit more siding with. But it's also just, it is a beautiful moment in the movie, and it's given the weight as such.
Yeah, and so after that is when they go to the club, and I just love the fact that they're having these conversations over playing pinball. I could not focus on a conversation if I
Yeah.
was trying to play pinball, or vice versa. Uh, I won't lie. That's part of what I was thinking about as the scene
Yeah.
was going on. I was like, nope, it's got to be one or the other. I can't focus on both. But and this is when things get personal about like their well, even more personal, that is, about their relationships that they've recently been going through. And this is where she tells him about the therapist and the story she wrote, which at this point is like, I jokingly thought, oh, now he's the scared one. But and then but then he tells the story. He tells her about his breakup,
Yeah.
and um, and I thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense. You
Yeah.
know, for how he's been sort of portraying himself,
Mhm.
and the fact that you can tell this is someone who's really romantic, but also he's being very cynical because he's in a lot of pain right now.
And it feels very authentic that it would come out in that moment, when after they've shared these experiences that are very clearly real and the connection is strengthening, and they're kind of running out of ways to hide from each other. That's when he's actually willing to tell her the truth about what brought him to Europe in the first place, and specifically got him on that train where he met her. And as you said, it's a very like realistic story, because it's understandable why he would be so bitter. Just honestly, the fact that he saved up all his money to fly to Europe to be with his then girlfriend, and she couldn't tell him over the phone, "Don't come." She let him come all the way there, and then it basically gave him the cold shoulder of, "I wish you hadn't come." That would make anyone rightfully angry and a little cynical. And then and when he talks about the fact that and then you think about the fact that everyone who's ever broken up with you, and everyone you've ever broken up with, and how little they're thinking about you, because that's how little you thought about anybody else that you had broken up with. Hey, I'm glad you're gone. You can see why he's been always part of the way that he's been throughout this movie, in addition to just kind of having that kind of a little bit more of a rebel mentality, like that scene earlier in the movie where he talked about his parents, and the fact that he always kind of felt like he was crashing the big party. The world was a place he wasn't meant to be, because his dad probably didn't want to have him, and his mom got pregnant by accident. You can see how that kind of forms a little bit of his harder edge, where he's like, well, then I'm going to kind of be a little bit more forceful in staking my claim into my place in this world. But also, you still want to believe that you can have that sense of belonging, because that's what he really is seeking there. It's one thing to say somebody doesn't want me here, but I'm going to be here anyway. It's another thing to actually live that. You want to feel like you're welcomed and belonging, and he's finding that in this by finally allowing himself to be in the moment with this woman.
Yeah, and oh god, that's I haven't been in that situation romantically, because okay, let's just be blunt. My love life has been uneventful, throughout my life. Uh, but uh, but I have that. But I think even outside of a romantic context, everyone can sort of appreciate that, because I think we've all been in that situation with some kind of relationship we're in, even just friendships of you think that you have this maybe you think you have this friendship with a person, but then you find yourself in group situations and it's not on the same level as what you think. And which, by the way, this is not, I should make it clear since we're on this stream, which is going out to a lot of our friends, this is not a story I'm relaying about anything in the past few years, but prior to that, just so we're clear. But that is like a very horrible feeling. Mm-hmm. And so you immediately you feel for him, because that is so totally something that could have just been, settled over a phone call.
Yeah.
And
this is one of those areas where, like, even though I consider this movie very timeless in terms of the emotional and character stories, there are probably certain plot developments that could have been resolved a bit easier if it weren't for the fact this movie took place in 1994. Because, if you did, I'm sure there was like long distance phone calling charges, international rates in the kind of pre-cell phone days were sky high. So yeah, there's a reason for it, but it's also like, before he saved up for 6 months and flew all the way over there, could have found a way to let him know. Yeah. But then we wouldn't have got this movie, so I'm glad that she was a little bit of a jerk.
I'm sorry, but my mind always just goes right back to The Dark Knight, where I think, Mr. Fox, a phone call might have sufficed.
Yes, yes, it would have. Yes, in both cases. But also, just to kind of fix in with what Céline's kind of feeling in that scene, Céline has honestly been much more like comfortable and laid back, but we also see a little bit of an edge to her. We've clearly gotten the sense that she's very passionate. She's got a lot of causes she cares about. She's very interested in being forthright with her emotions. Nice. Hey, Eric. Thanks for stopping in. But also that, she also has an edge to her because, she has, when she talks about her parents and the fact that they were like these rebels who kind of gave her, but then they kind of settled into more like boring suburban lives and gave her everything. But she still kind of feels the need to push and define her own identity, and she doesn't want it to be contingent on, somebody else, which makes it all the more frustrating when she tells the story about her former relationship and the fact that she like basically was dating this guy after what she perceived as sympathy, but then he dumped her because he's like, oh, you're holding me back artistically, and she's like, what? And so she, in her words, becomes obsessed with him. And then that's when she relates the story about like writing that story about a woman killing her former boyfriend and getting away with it, that her therapist takes seriously. And the thing about that is like, you could see how you're like, oh wow, like perhaps she does have a deeper reservoir of anger here. But then she becomes a little bit more emotionally honest again in that phone call scene where she talks about the fact that like the only person I could really hurt is myself. And that's incredibly relatable too, because as she says in that scene, like obviously she didn't love the guy. She then got over him. She was just, struggling in that moment, as we all do when we go through something like that. So these characters find themselves in oddly similar situations, even though they are, they came to it in different ways from different life experiences. But they happen to find each other at this absolutely perfect time, and it's one of the reasons why they're having this magical night together. And that connection continues to deepen as the story continues.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's the fact that it just shows how like deep their connection is, that like as they get to this point, they're willing to sort of talk about these types of things, because you wouldn't want to talk about these things to someone that you weren't developing some kind of a connection to. And yeah, but it's really when they get to that the phone call scene that like another one of my like absolute favorite moments in the movie. Like I was enjoying the movie throughout, and there were definitely moments that I responded to, like the you know like the listening booth scene, and 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 other scenes. But I think it was really like the phone call scene down at the table where I just started to really get like really hooked into their connection, and because that's the point where they really are letting their guards completely down, and they're just saying, okay, this is how I feel, and I think it's just such a beautiful moment. I do love when it starts off with her going, yeah, and so I got off the train with this guy I met, and then he goes, I forget what he says exactly, but it's like, what are you, crazy? and it's just like it was like giving voice to what I was thinking at the beginning of the movie, and and I thought that was great, and no, it's just great because they get to say what's boiling under the surface, and it gives them an excuse to say that to each other under the pretext of saying it to somebody else, and yeah, so I just thought it was the point in the movie where it was just allowed to be so emotionally open and raw, and it just from there on out, like the movie had me like so like connected, and and yeah.
Yeah, this movie, like, it does take a little bit of time to get into because, again, you have to get on its wavelength, you have to buy into the premise, and the early part of the movie is like them forging their connection and feeling each other out, and we don't really like know these characters that well yet. So if you happen to like bump up against something, like, you might get pulled out of it a little bit, but like if you find something that resonates with you, you get drawn deeper in. And for me, like, it really started to, like, the first time I watched this movie, I was like really enjoying it, through the first like half of it, but I really started to fall head over heels in love with it in the second part of it. Once, as we said, these illusions are kind of getting stripped away, and the characters are being much more emotionally open and honest with each other. And the scene, like, that phone scene is an incredibly powerful example of that, with a little bit of a wry edge to it, as you noted, with them like impersonating each other's friends, and actually doing a pretty good job of it with the "Are you insane?" and the "Hey dude, what's up?" kind of
Oh, but
illusion.
one of the best parts though is it starts off with her just carrying on the conversation in French, and he's like, so I've decided to practice my English a bit more. I want to do that.
Yeah, and she kind of like did that on purpose, which she like owns up to the fact that she's been very like intentional with all that throughout the movie, where she had decided to get off the train with him before he even asked her in that way. But the moment, like, I actually do want to back up a tiny bit to the scene that takes place before that, which I think you alluded to, which is the scene in the alleyway. Where, because that, like, as much as I adore all this in this, like, this entire movie, and think the entire experience is greater than even the sum of its individual moments and parts, that is my favorite scene. And it's because this is when the characters really tear open their hearts and kind of give us a sense of what's truly driving them and what they're actually seeking in sharing these things. And it's specific to their characters, but it has one of my single favorite lines of dialogue from any movie character. And it's one that actually is like informed as I said at the beginning, like how I engage with cinematic art and life in general, because I just found that resonant. And it's the dynamic where when Céline and Jesse, they're having their banter about men and women and how they go, sometimes don't connect or don't see eye to eye about certain things. But then it shifts where they start talking about love and what it is they're actually looking for in love. And Céline talks about, she says, I feel this pressure to be a strong and independent icon of womanhood and not have it look like my life was only revolving around some guy, but the love of the man the love of a man returning that love means a lot to me. I always make fun of it and stuff, but isn't everything we do in life a way to be loved a little bit more? And that is an incredibly resonant idea. And then Jesse shares the idea about but sometimes I just dream about being a good father or a good husband, and sometimes it feels close, but it also feels silly, like it would. And it's not that I have a fear of commitment or I'm incapable of loving or caring about something else, because I can. It's that if I'm totally honest with myself, I'd rather die knowing that I was really good at something, that I was special and excelled in some way, rather than just being in a nice, caring relationship. And that's something that also feels very resonant, particularly to anyone who's ever felt the pull between a romantic connection and their career. But then Céline really gets into the heart of it, where her response, where she talks about she had once worked for this older guy, and he had told her about how he had devoted all his life thinking about his career and his work. And suddenly he was 52, and it struck him that he had never really given anything of himself, that his life was for no one and nothing. He was almost crying saying that. And she doesn't importantly specify a romantic connection there. She just points out that he was doing everything in his life for himself. And that's when she has what I think is the really most beautiful line in the entire movie, and the one that I always return to as one of my favorite just movie lines, is when she says, quote, "I really believe that if there's any kind of God, he wouldn't be in any one of us, not you, not me, but just this space in between. If there's some kind of magic in this world, it must be in the attempt of understanding someone else sharing something, even if it's almost impossible to succeed. But who cares? The answer must be in the attempt." That's it. That's the movie right there, because that is an example of the characters throughout this movie and all throughout our lives. We have things that we love. We have things that we're passionate about. We have things that move us, that shape us, and we want other people to understand. Whether it's a romantic connection, a connection of friendship, a professional connection, we want people to understand us, but it's so hard to communicate why it is that these things are important to us, and what it is that we actually want, and why we need this connection. So some people don't make that effort at all, but some people do, and then they put themselves out there, and it's terrifying to do it. And they're just hoping that somebody else will understand what it is they're trying to say. And sometimes the other party understands perfectly, but sometimes they don't. But where it really gets messy, but also beautiful, is the idea that you may not understand completely, but if you can see that another person is trying to reach out, is trying to, communicate something about themselves to the world, it doesn't matter if you don't understand them perfectly, as long as you make the attempt. And that is something that I have actually, just even beyond my fun hobby of engaging with movies, and this movie in particular, that is something I've actually tried to apply to my actual life with some success, because that's it. That is the human experience right there. And I just find it to be such a powerful scene.
Yeah, and like I was saying earlier, I think one of the most impactful things about that scene also is that that's one of the moments where Jesse just lets the silence sit after she says that. He doesn't feel the need to, you know, to interject something, to, you know, to sort of, you know, fill in the quiet space and disturb the moment. He just lets it play, and yeah, it's that is a beautiful moment.
And within the context of the movie itself, I just find it like, I think it's the emotional linchpin of the scene and the entire trilogy in some respects. But it's also just, it's a beautiful thought. It's a beautiful idea. And, you know, it is the central idea of what it is to try and communicate to someone, not only through art and cinematic art in this way, but just any kind of communication, the attempt being made to share something, this idea of the space in between and reaching out across it, and the answer must be in the attempt. I've rarely seen a line of dialogue distill an idea that perfectly, and I'm just so glad that the movie recognized it and allowed it to just kind of sit there for
Now we can go back and and interject about some other moments as we go on, but I really do want to talk about basically the final act of the movie, from the point where they discuss about whether this is going to be a just one night only thing, or if they're going to or if they're going to try and stay in contact from that point to the rest of the movie, because that for me, it's just so emotional all the way through to the end. And in that moment, they agree that it'll just be that this will be it, you know, until of course, get to the very end of the movie. Because really it's from that moment on that even more so they feel the ticking clock of the rest of the night. And it's very notable that he's the one who's like, well, you don't think we're going to see each other again? And so it's like, again, the guy who's trying to portray himself as Mr. Cynic, like he is, totally, he's the one sort of who believes in, in the romantic side of things, that yes, of course, they're going to see each other again. But he kind of agrees at that point. Okay, so this is it. But everything that proceeds from that point on is, flies in the face of that.
Yeah.
And so, and I don't want to jump forward too much because we can take a moment to talk about that, but I will just say, like, the scene in the grass is just like tugged on my heartstrings so much. And but we can build up to that. So so I don't know, what do you have to say just about this section?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you singled out that scene where they're having kind of the like dinner or coffee or something on the boat, and it's the moment where, having now had that scene where we mentioned about the understanding that the answer must be in the attempt, and having like their connection, that where they're being open about just how deeply they're starting to feel each other or for each other with their phone conversation. That's when they start to reckon with the idea that we're about to lose this because the hour is drawing late. And then earlier in the movie, they might not have decided to talk about it because they hadn't gotten to this point emotionally, but now they do, because they're so both afraid of what will happen if once this night ends. And they kind of start to reckon with like different ideas, like what if we try to visit each other. I'll fly back to the States, or I'll fly back to Europe, or you'll come visit me in the States. And as they're saying it, one of the like authentic things is like they start to realize just how tall of an order that would be, and just what a challenge they're up against, being divided literally by an ocean.
And this isn't that long after he's relayed the story about his long distance relationship that blew up. So it's a tall order. That's an understatement.
Yeah. And we can see that, but they want to try to make it work, where like Céline's like, I'm not so scared of flying, I mean I could. But then they give themselves permission to, in that another beautiful scene, permission to say goodbye to each other, like right there. And they hold hands, and Jesse's like, say goodbye, and she's like, goodbye, and he's like, see ya later, au revoir. And it's like, and it's cute and funny, but it's also like you can tell that there's real emotional power behind it, but also it's freeing, because it does kind of give them the chance to say like, okay, we're just, what if would it be so bad if this were our one and only night? This has been magical, this has been great, let's just enjoy it. And then they give themselves permission to do that. But as we see, that's not actually what they want, because they almost immediately start working against it. Once you get to the later scene in the park, and then ultimately at the train station, because it was a very incredibly sweet moment, but it was ultimately them trying to be mature adults, as Céline says. But that's not what they want at this stage of their life. They want to be, young and in love, and so this new construct that they've just put in place becomes like the next thing to like push against and rebel against, where they're almost immediately looking for ways to keep their connection alive. And when they get to the scene in the park, and Jesse has the line about like, if I had the choice right now between never seeing you again and marrying you right now, I would marry you. And she's like, you're like, I don't want you to just say that to get in my pants, but she also means it, because clearly that's what she wants to.
Well, I find it in retrospect. I wasn't thinking about this in the moment, but in retrospect, I find it so funny. Like, she's the one who introduces effing into the conversation, and then she's like, I think we probably shouldn't sleep together. It's like she is the one who brings that into like, creates that as an undercurrent to the scene. And then from what I can tell, I guess it's left ambiguous, but my read on it was that they were together. But
I'll just say, like, it's a plot point in the next movie, and yes, ultimately they did sleep together. But it is a they do play with it wonderfully, and for this movie's purposes, I love that it's left ambiguous, and that they, as you said, Céline brings it up, and then she kind of like pulls it back at first because of just some emotional like insecurity, like if we sleep together and then we're separated, like that'll just make it hurt even worse. I'll wonder who else you're with. And then that's when Jesse starts to say like, let's see each other again. And he's not just saying that because he wants to sleep with her in this moment. He actually does want to see with her. And then she kind of teases him with like, she's like, actually, I decided I wanted to sleep with you when we got off the train, but now that we've talked so much, I don't know anymore. And then I just love that moment where he like puts his head in the grass. But then they
I do love his like, it's all right, we don't have to sleep together. It's not that important.
It lasts all of 10 seconds. It's because clearly these two
Yeah.
do wanna sleep together in the middle of an open park in the middle of Vienna after having had a bottle of
Yeah, it's
questionably
like
obtained.
it's in your head. It's been brought up.
Yeah,
You're, laying out on the grass. You've been drinking. Come on, guys. That's gonna
yeah.
happen.
And happen it does, but again,
Yeah.
with ambiguously for this movie's purposes.
But but even with that ambiguity, like you can tell then with the rest of the scenes because it is sort of underlined and underneath it of they've like really given themselves over to this deep,
Yeah.
love, so that like even before you get to that moment at the train, it's like, ooh, this is not going to, like, it's not going to be an easy goodbye, and and just like the little moments, just you know, uh, they're dancing next to the harpsichord, the window with the
Yeah.
harpsichord player, the taking of the imaginary pictures, and then the way they're just holding each other, sitting, on the what is it, like a fountain or something, and it's just like, oh yeah, this is this deep connection that
Yeah.
it's going to be pretty hard to have this just be left at a one night only thing. Yeah.
Indeed, and I do feel like that, them ultimately having sex in the park is what gives them that like release, that physical release that like it has been the manifestation of their attraction, but the emotional attraction, if anything, becomes only even more intense after that, because as you alluded to, that beautiful scene where they're going by and the window and they see the man playing the harpsichord, and then they kind of dance, and then he takes her picture and she takes his in their mind, and it's, you can tell like when Jesse has a line in that scene where he's like, "Oh shoot, we're back in real time," and this movie hasn't, even though it's been kind of on a clock in a very discrete time frame, it hasn't been proceeding in like full real time. We've had some time skips. We can see now it was night, it's now daytime. Clearly, we know, we're coded to see even cinematically that like their time together is growing short. But they still give us these moments of them trying to be in the moment with the picture and the dancing, and then the scene at the fountain, and her, this is, it's where the poster of the movie comes from, where they're in this scene, and then he reads her the W.H. Auden poem as read by Dylan Thomas, and he makes the idea of time explicit with all the clocks in the city.
I love that he recites the poem and he's like, or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Because clearly it's a poem, like the poet on the Viennese poet by the river. Like clearly this was a poem he's experienced with this kind of stuff. He's listened to this poem a fair few times. And the whole like, oh, let not time deceive you. You cannot conquer time. In headaches and in worry, vaguely life leaks away, and time will have his fancy tomorrow or today. And I love that he imitates Dylan Thomas's voice with that, which I did not do because I could not do that justice. But it's that is another case of the movie like making its kind of meta commentary on the whole dynamic at play here explicit, and doing it in a way that a lesser movie I might have found that a little bit obnoxious or on the nose. In this movie I don't, because it just feels so authentic to the characters and the experience that has unfolded to this point. I think the movie has earned the right to do something like this.
Well, and plus it's the complete pulling back of like the mask of the cynic does not have Dylan Thomas poem memorized.
Yeah.
It's and so in that way, that's another reason why it's so beautiful, because it's like that that illusion has completely come down, and you're left with the fact that Jesse is a romantic at heart.
Yeah. as is Céline, because she also has another beautiful idea in that sequence where she talks about the fact that, like, contrary to the whole thing about, like, if we were together all the time and we would start to notice each other's mannerisms and they would annoy us, she reveals that that's not actually what she thinks either. You know, it's like, I actually think I could really fall in love with someone once I start to know all these little details about him, the shirt that he would wear every day, what story he would tell, and that's when I would know that I'm really in love. And then she kind of just looks up at him, and then she does, as I alluded to earlier, then she kind of returns the gesture of reaching up and kind of touching a lock of hair away from his face, and then his reaction where he just kind of like closes his eyes and puts his head back and leans into it, like, just that her light touch in that scene, like, just is sending like electricity through his body right there. And you can tell he's trying to hold on to that moment and that feeling. He's trying to keep it with him always, even though he knows their time is running short. And it's, again, just incredibly authentic and beautiful, and very much a case of the performers taking moments even within this very well rehearsed and naturalistic screenplay and giving it a little bit extra just with their reactions there.
Yeah, and then there's when they get to the train, and like, it just breaks the heart watching them try and find the right words to say goodbye to each other. And it's like, what can you possibly say in that moment? And until finally he's just like, screw it. I don't want this to goodbye. And then they have the back and forth of like, why didn't you say anything? It's like, I don't know. And it's and then and I love that first she says, well, meet right here in 5 years. He's like, 5 years? And she's like, I know, that's stupid. It's like a science experiment.
Yeah.
And and they settle on 6 months, and then that's why I do kind of want to just sit with this movie for a little while before watching the next one, because for me it just feels like such a perfect ending, because you're left then to kind of, come up in your head with then what follows, and and so I have my own picture of that, and I'm sure it's I'm sure something different from that happens with the following films, but it is such a beautiful ending. So so for me, I'm just gonna sit with that, and for a while, and because it's beautiful, and I just love that the movie ends with yes, they've left each other, but they both smile by the time the credits roll, and and just the way that when they're saying goodbye to each other, the way they embrace and the way they kiss, and it's just it's amazing that you take that this is such a beautifully crafted story that it's so totally believable that you take these two people who at the beginning of this movie are strangers, you have them spend one night getting to know each other and spending that time together, and then by the end of the movie you're completely convinced that these two people are madly in love, and that's a tall order for to believably do that, and I thought this movie did a great job with it. And it's funny because my before we started the stream, I had said that I enjoyed the movie, but now I think I've it's grown in my admiration just talking about it, and and talking about all these beats, and so so I think I may even want to watch it again before my rental expires, and take in all of this, and evaluate it that way, and And it's funny because this movie has had such a sort of, even without having seen it before, it has had such a legacy because I've heard about it over the years. And every time, one of the subsequent sequels came out, I remember like hearing from, the legions of fans of these films, getting so excited for it. And that's very unique among these kinds of independent films that, you know, that first of all, a film on this sort of level and budget that would have a sequel, let alone two, and that it has this kind of cult following. It is just, it's beautiful because it's, we hear about the trajectory of cinema, and you know and how everything's big budget, big budget, big budget, and so the idea that a movie like this can have its own sort of legions of fans and build itself into this, not quite a franchise, but but a trilogy of films that it has to be quite unique in cinema.
Yeah, no, that's why I said it's like I consider these movies to be such a special experiment and achievement, because there is no movie quite like it, and certainly no trilogy of movies quite like it. And I'm so glad to hear that, as we've been talking about it, that, you're starting to, appreciate new nuances in the movie that you like hadn't maybe considered fully as on an initial watch, because this is the kind of movie that is hard to have just watched once. And why I'm so grateful that you were willing to do it after, just watching it for the first time, because when we watch a movie for the first time, we usually do watch it for the story, and specifically like what happens, and it's kind of hard for us to fully reckon with every little emotional detail and nuance of dialogue and acting choice until we know what happens. The first time I watched this movie, I loved it from the jump, but I didn't adore it with the fiery passion that I do now, because the first time I watched it, I was watching it through very similar eyes. I was watching it to find out the story and what happened. And the movie gave me enough on that watch that I was able to come back to it, and rewatch it. And then I started watching it for the little character moments and the flourishes of dialogue. And now I know the movie so well that I'm like, oh, this scene's coming up, and I'm gonna, be able to pay attention to this aspect of it, and I'm gonna listen to the music a little bit more in this scene, or see the way that the actors are kind of interpreting this particular dynamic. And that's when, kind of like what Céline says in that scene, like that's when you really like fall sincerely in love with the movie, is when you can do that. And I do think the time aspect of it, not only like within real life, but also within these movies themselves, is essential to that, because as I mentioned earlier, like these movies were ultimately filmed 9 years apart, and they reflect that in the characters' lives as well. And so for the people who did watch it when it initially came out, they did have 9 years to sit with it and think about if there were going to be another one, which was not a guarantee, but they ultimately did make them. What would I want it to be? And without spoiling any specifics, that's kind of what the next movie kind of opens, by asking that question in a weird way. Like people having different ideas about what this movie was like. What happened? Did they reunite? Did they not? Like what could have gone, differently? And I ultimately didn't wait 9 years between watching these movies, but I had a similar instinct of like, I couldn't wait to jump right into the next one, but I'm like, but this movie deserves to have me sit with it just for a little bit and kind of get it settled. And so ultimately it ended up being like a couple weeks before I watched the next one, and then the subsequent films in the before
Which is
Sunset.
kind of another it's kind of another reason why I'm glad that our schedule is going to be changing up a little bit, because I'm actually fully fine with, doing just discussion of the next two films. But I do feel like I want this to sit for a little bit longer than just 2 weeks. Uh, because it does, especially knowing the sort of length. Granted, I don't want to wait 9 years.
Don't.
but give it a little bit, and 2 weeks would be a bit too quick for me. I'd like to sit with it for just a little bit longer, and because like I said, the ending just leaves you feeling like you can imagine, what happens from there, and so I do want to let that sort of, simmer a bit before I find out what the actual next chapter is.
Yeah, and I think that that's totally fair and appropriate, and I'm actually, in retrospect, like I'm because I've seen these movies so many times, I was so very gung-ho to like, let's talk about them all. But I also I do think it's important for you and for your own experience with these movies to be able to watch them kind of on your own terms and like sit with them for as long as you like. I do hope that you decide that we do end up talking about the next two, Before Sunset and Before Midnight, and that we will be able to discuss them, because it does change the experience. It doesn't alter my feelings about this movie in any way and how perfect and beautiful I think it is, but it does make it part of a larger story. So it recontextualizes a few things. And I think that is and I personally think that as a trilogy, these movies tie together beautifully narratively and thematically. And this is a case where it's not like, oh, it's 3 separate movies in a trilogy. It's like they are greater than the sum of their parts once they're all together, but it is different. So I think that it's entirely fair to, sit with this one chapter for a little bit, and then when you're ready, hopefully, learn the next chapter in the story.
Yeah, don't worry, I won't make you wait like what Stev and Nessie did to me with the first 3 seasons of, our discussions of the first 3 seasons of Clone Wars, where there were like 6 months in between each discussion. It won't be that bad. Trust me. And then of course it always cracks me, and of course I'm teasing with them if they end up listening to this, but it does always crack me up how after we hit season 3, then strangely our discussions increased every couple of weeks. Because of course, as we all know, after the back half of season 3 of Clone Wars, that show picks up incredibly. But it does crack me up in retrospect, me being like, are we gonna talk about the next season of Clone Wars, guys? Huh? Yeah. So don't worry, it won't be anything remotely like that. But yeah, it's. So did we skip over anything that you wanted to bring up?
Not necessarily within the context of the movie. Just I did have one thing I wanted to talk about at the end, but before we get there, just specifically within the end, like as you mentioned, the desperation and the sense of urgency when that moment finally arrives, and the whole like Cinderella's glass slipper, will it fit? You can feel the characters like, no, we actually really do want it to fit. We want this to happen. We want to make it real. And like their kind of back and forth dynamic is both hilarious. Like when Céline's like, have a great life. And then he's like, actually, let's see each other again. And she's like, you never ask. But it's beautiful. And then the closing montage is gorgeous when they go back, and this is a case of the movie, like the direction and the cinematography elevating again the screenplay, where they go back and they specifically show us all the moments where Jesse and Céline were having these encounters earlier in the evening, and now they're ordinary and they're within the light of day, and Céline and Jesse are gone, and it just looks, to anyone who didn't know the story that we just watched, like a totally nondescript place, almost as if they were never there, except in the park, because they left the wine bottle and the glasses behind, the little wither bugs. But it's a beautiful way to frame it, because for a movie that's very much about the idea of like capturing moments in time and like the people who made them special, like those places hold now added weight and power in our mind, because we know what happened there and the connection that Jesse and Céline, forged. And it makes it, I just think it's a beautiful way to end it before it, shows them both on the train. And as you said, they kind of have their little smile as they're looking out the window. And
it's just a shame, because I think if this had been in the age of, post-credit scenes, we would have gotten at least a snippet of the cow play.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very happy, very bittersweet ending, but a happy ending. But for those two guys, I hope somebody went to the play.
It really does sound like there's an episode of, I think there's an episode of American Dad where they're in it's either LA or New York or something, and they get a pamphlet for an evening with Robert Wool handed out by the actor Robert Wool, and it's just like an evening at his house. And it's got that kind of a vibe to it. But no, I hope it was a success for those guys.
Yeah, I do too. They don't come back in the next two movies, so we will. If that isn't the answer, we will never know. But it is.
The real cliffhanger. Yeah. But no, I'm very glad I got to watch this movie, and I was a bit nervous because I ended up leaving this until last night. I turned it on, and I was like, oh, you should have watched this earlier, because what if you don't like it? You have to tell Jared at the last minute. We have a problem. But no, I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, no, and thank you for agreeing to do it. As we mentioned, usually we pick movies on this channel that we both already know, we both love. There have been a couple instances, like when you volunteered Hugo, that one of us hadn't seen the movie, but so it's a different dynamic when we do that, or something like Doom Part 2, where like we were both watching it for the first time, and unfortunately we both really loved that movie. But it's it's never a guarantee. I didn't want to assume anything. I didn't want to assume that you would like it. I certainly wasn't expecting you to love it as much as I do on the first watch, but I am glad that you found something that resonated with you, and hopefully if you do decide to rewatch it, and then when we get the chance to talk about the rest, it'll add to your experience, because these are the kind of movies that you really, I do think a rewatch rewards you, and you find new things to love.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing watching something like this for the first time, especially when I knew you loved it so much. But also, I know that it has such a big following, and so automatically there's expectations built up, and for me, a first viewing of a movie is like, unless it's it's a out of this world amazing, like something that fires on all cylinders that affects me in a very personal way, then that first viewing, that experience will stick. But more often than not, I find it's my repeat viewings that determine my ultimate affection for a movie, which is why it always drives me crazy when, and this could turn into a therapist couch discussion about my dynamic with my dad and how he views movies and stuff. Because to him, it's always like, if he's seen it once, that's enough. And he doesn't understand why anybody would want to watch a movie a second time unless it's Spaceballs. Um, and but for me, like, more often than not, that first viewing only tells me what the story was, and it doesn't allow me to peel back the layers, as you were talking about. And um, because for me, how can you fully appreciate all the nuances of a film if you don't yet know how it plays out? Which is not to say I never want spoilers, because
Yeah.
I want that first viewing to be a surprise in how the story unfolds. But I also won't, but also the full embracing of it can't happen until after I've experienced that story in its entirety and I go back to appreciate all the nuances.
Mhm.
And you can never appreciate those nuances on a first viewing. It's just impossible. So for me, like, unless I hate a movie, a second viewing is always, like, completely necessary. Um, I and even there's been a lot of times where I've been underwhelmed by something on a first viewing, and then it winds up being my favorite movie. The story I always tell is Kill Bill Volume 2, which I was blown away by Volume 1. It was my first Tarantino movie that I ever saw, and unfortunately that set up expectations for what kind of filmmaker Tarantino was, because Volume 1 is so style over substance in a really great way. Um, but Volume 2 Volume 2 certainly has a lot of style, but it's much more substance, and it's about sort of slowing down and peeling back the layers of the characters. And I just wanted a repeat of Volume 1 with all the amazing action and quick cuts and all that stuff. And it wasn't until I saw that movie on DVD that I appreciated it, and it's, with the exception of maybe Inglourious Bastards, it's my favorite Tarantino film.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you never really know where you stand on a movie until you've seen it a couple times.
Absolutely. I definitely have that experience with some of my favorite movies as well. It's including these three, this trilogy, but also other movies I've encountered. Like, as you said, it's rare that, like, I have what I term the Blade Runner 2049 experience, where I walk into a movie and then I walk out, I'm like, I have just watched the like one of the greatest movies I've ever seen in my life. But usually it's like real life love, life, it builds over time, and once you get to know
And sometimes when it's an experience like the Blade Runner 2049 viewing, sometimes you go back for a second viewing expecting, like, that same hit, and it's not quite there, and you're like, oh, was it as good as I thought? But then you see it a third time,
third
and
time, yeah,
then you appreciate it fully. And
yeah,
so you do have to kind of be careful with
right.
those ones that are magic on that first viewing, because you may never fully replicate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's but I know what you mean there. I just and that'll be a whole separate conversation when we do our revisited stream for Blade Runner 2049, because I've said this before, but I've always respected the original Blade Runner more than outright loved it. And but I've always heard about the kind of experience that people who love that film had with it, and what their reaction was. And all I remember thinking as I walked out of 2049 was, oh, this is what they meant. Because that's what the whole world felt different to me after I walked out of that movie. Because, like, I saw, like, just there'd be certain things you driving around that might remind you of something out of the movie, and and the world that's built up. And yeah, so I can't wait until we have a chance to talk about that one, because that is one of the few movies in my sort of later years that I went to go see, like, multiple times, until another one that I've just recently done that with, of course, has been Dune Part Two.
Yeah.
Gee, what a coincidence! But yeah, so that'll be a fun conversation when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I did mention that one thing I did want to kind of just acknowledge out there, because it's something that I didn't know the first time I watched these movies, and so it didn't inform my experience at all. I'd seen the entire trilogy and fallen in love with it before I really started to delve into Richard Linklater's thought process behind what was the inspiration for this movie. And because I didn't these movies are what made Richard Linklater one of my favorite working directors. I haven't seen every film in his filmography, but he's kind of known for being much more autobiographical, making films based on experiences in his own life. He's very open about the fact that he is much more interested in capturing moments and slices of life, and make kind of authentically living in the moment, rather than trying to construct a hard narrative. And you see that in other films of his, like Boyhood or Slackers. But these films are unique because they are, as we said, extremely carefully written and rehearsed and planned out, and they become very distinctive and very shaped by all the participants. Kim Krisian was his co-writer on this movie. He kind of brought her in because he wanted to have a kind of a very authentic female voice, to help him write the scenes and the dynamic between Jesse and Céline. And he had worked with her on Dazed and Confused and Slackers. So she was instrumental in this first movie. Going forward, Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy actually take even more ownership. They're actually credited as co-writers on both Before Sunset and Before Midnight.
Oh, nice.
And they were both Oscar nominated alongside Richard Linklater for both Before Sunset and Before Midnight. This film is the one that didn't get that recognition, but it was a surprise, But the big thing that I just wanted to mention is the thing that everyone always asked Richard Linklater is how did you get this idea? When did you decide you wanted to write a movie like this? Because people talk about writing movies like this, they're just slice of life kind of stories, but sometimes there is an inspiration for it. And in this case, there is. He has been very open in talking about these movies, that this first movie was inspired by a real life encounter that he had back in 1989, when he was still kind of a young startup filmmaker, very much looking to kind of break into, making movies for a living. He was in Philadelphia, and he did actually have a chance encounter with a young woman named Amy Lehrhout. I'll pronounce it Amy Lehrhout. I'll put her name in the chat so that you can see how it's pronounced. But the reason it's important is because this movie, the idea for this movie comes directly from the connection that he forged with her. He basically talks about, he met this woman at a Toy Story. They had a very similar, authentic connection between them, and they basically spent a night like this, walking around, talking, and sharing dynamics. They talked about different things. It was a different dynamic. They didn't ultimately I don't think it was quite as overtly romantic, even though there was a little bit of a flirtatious connection there. But it was a very real and authentic connection, and it stuck with him. It was the reason he ultimately decided to make this movie. He told her that he was going to do that during the process. I'm going to make a movie about this one day, and they had a good laugh about it. But then he did. He actually did make the movie. But he hadn't reestablished contact with her, and he basically was like, I wonder if she ever saw the movie, and I wonder if she had knew it was based about her. And he talked about this in the press tour. And then when he was making the sequel, Before Sunset, he did. He also talked about it. and he talks about it, and it's a line basically in the movie as well. Like, I think in this movie, in some ways I wrote it to like try and find you. Not and at this point he's he's married, he has a different connection. I think he was looking more to just connect with her again. And then, as they got closer to making the third movie in like 2010, he actually received a letter from a friend of Amy's who had seen his movies, had followed his career, and recognized that it was based on his interaction with this woman. And she actually shared with him that the young woman that he had based this interaction, this movie on, his connection with her, and that had ultimately helped, shape and define his career. Like, she had actually died in 1994 in a motorcycle accident, right before, 3 months before he was going to make this first movie. So she never got to see it. She never knew it would, it was going to be based on her, but it left an impression on her, on him, and the people in their life. There's actually a great video, a YouTube video by this guy, Jeff Rowan, called Amy Learhart, the inspiration behind Before Sunrise, where he connected with her mother and kind of got the story about her life. And I'll put a link to it in the comments section of the chat, but it's a sad story because her life was cut short in tragedy. She was 25 when she died. And it's a different thing that I always feel like I need to acknowledge, because, when people talk about real life inspiring art, sometimes that can be a loaded subject. And ultimately, when people base movies that on their real life experiences, it's going to change in the fictional telling. Jesse and Céline are not Richard Linklater and Amy Learhart. The original inspiration of the idea was their interaction, but Jesse and Céline became their own characters, shaped by Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy. Obviously, the fact that Richard Linklater and Amy Learhart never got to reconnected because Amy was killed in the accident. And so the following two movies are very much, just based on the dynamic that was forged in this movie. But the original idea is still there. And whenever it is based on someone's real life, it is important to, recognize that. And the people in her life who lost a very real person. And it is notable that he learned this in 2010, before Midnight came out. And Before Midnight, the third and to date final film in the trilogy, is dedicated to her.
Yeah, I read about that on the Wikipedia page. Either before or right after I watched the movie. It's so incredibly sad.
Yeah. And I don't say that to like bring the movie down. It's just like I didn't know that the first several times I watched these movies. And like I was always curious about like, what inspired it? Like, it probably was based on a real life interaction. I didn't know the real life, tragedy behind it. And Richard Linklater didn't either when he was making the movie. But obviously, like they just had their one night, and Jesse and Céline have their one night in this movie. Ultimately, their story does continue in these subsequent movies. But and as I mentioned, they're very much their own characters, and the fiction that is played out in these movies is shaped, much more by Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy's experiences going forward. But the original idea was a connection between Richard Linklater and this woman who is tragically no longer with us. So I found that important to acknowledge, because it makes things a little bit more bittersweet, especially knowing that Jesse and Céline's stories do continue. But it is also like it doesn't mean that the movie is somehow like retroactively tinged by that for me. It just means that like the difference
Yeah.
between real life and art, you know, there is a clear dividing line, and in this case, there was an inspiration, and ultimately, a real woman's life was lost. And who knows what she would have thought of these movies? By all accounts, she was a woman who was very like full of life and spirit and interaction, and it seems, and again, I'll link to that video essay that I watched in the chat, where she just is clearly, you know, she had a lot of positive influence on the people around her, and so her spirit hopefully, you know, lives on, and her memory lives on by association through these movies. And I just wanted that acknowledged.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where, you know, you both want to acknowledge the difference between art and real life, but also there's a, you know, at least a silver lining with the existence of the films that that maybe will draw attention to the real life woman, and she can in that way, uh, you know, obviously she'll be remembered anyway by her family and those who loved her, but it's kind of nice to have this as an additional remembrance,
Yeah.
you know, of her. Um, yeah. So anyway, so as far as just sort of recapping what we talked about before with what we're doing going forward, next week we're taking the week off. Just because you have some stuff going on, I needed a week off anyway. And so then we'll be back the following Sunday, which will be on the 12th, same time as usual.
Yep.
And we'll be talking about the final episodes of Star Wars: The Bad Batch, which will actually be good that we'll have an extra week to kind of absorb that. And and we'll also be able to talk about the 6 shorts that will make up Tales of the Empire, and hopefully we'll have some news about the next forthcoming animated show. But I'd feel more confident about that if there was a Star Wars celebration this year. So who knows? We may have to wait a bit longer for that announcement, but we'll see. And then the week after that, we'll be talking about the 25th anniversary of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Just I'm. By the way, like we didn't talk about this side of it. We talked about our excitement about the movie coming back out in the theaters, but I like one of the things that I'm looking forward to talking a bit more about in that discussion, and what's been going on is it's really exciting the response that the re-release has been getting. For so many years, we had to put up with all the people who have an intense dislike for the Phantom Menace, and sort of ridiculing those of us who love it. And it's been so great, not just this year, but over the past couple of years with things like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, and this sort of resurgent prequel love in general, to really get to have people who grew up on not just the Phantom Menace, but the prequel films, and express their love for it. And I won't say who wrote the review, but I was reading a review the other day about the upcoming Blu-ray release or 4K release of Andor, and it was used as a way to take a pot shot at the direction George Lucas took the Star Wars franchise, uh, you know, following, even going all the way back to after Empire Strikes Back.
Yep.
this review like started taking shots at Return of the Jedi all the way through the special editions to the prequels and whatnot, and it's an example of like I don't begrudge anybody their personal opinion, but it's an example of not respecting the fact that Lucas intended this to be a generational story,
Yep.
and the fact that you may have hated the prequels, you may have thought episode 1 was dumb, but you know what, there's those of us who were the right age who saw that movie at the right time and loved it unconditionally, and you know what, we're the adults now, and we get to say what the legacy of that film is, and we're freaking excited as all hell for the 25th anniversary release of this movie, and we're going to go see it in theaters, and we're going to be cheering all throughout it. And you don't like that, you can suck on it. That's all I have to say. You know, but we're gonna have a blast talking about that.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a good couple hours, probably more, of us just heaping our love upon a movie that, again, like I was talking about before, I saw that movie at least a good 9 times in theaters, and I went with my friends, and you know what? We were cheering, we were laughing, we were having a great time. That's my memory of seeing that film in theaters, and finally we get to reclaim that.
Yeah. I am so looking forward to that discussion. I think it is going to be one of our most purely joyful discussions, with tinged with a little bit of the sadness of the reflections that, of the some of the reaction the movie initially received, particularly in the effect it had on like real world participants, and like honestly one of my single greatest joys in Star Wars fandom in the past few years has been not only seeing the way that the movie has been embraced by the fandom that was young when growing up, but in particular how the actors and who were part of the movie, and above all, Ahmed Best, who went through untold hell, completely unjustified the way he was treated, and now he is in a much better place and is like fully engaged with Star Wars again, and people love him, and is like the rapturous cheering that he got both at the Star Wars celebration and when he appeared on The Mandalorian. Just, it's one of my favorite Star Wars memories, irrespective of the movies. But the movie itself is wonderful. Jake Lloyd too, although as you may know, Jake Lloyd has other difficulties in his life. But it's just so great to be able to just say it openly and loudly and proudly that we adore this movie so much. It is so important to me specifically, and can't wait to celebrate in that vibe with all of you. And if you don't like the Phantom Menace as much, that's okay. But just say we are going to be full-throated in our enthusiasm of it. So, it's going, if that's not going to be your vibe, then perhaps, just be cognizant of that, because this will be a celebratory stream in so many ways.
Yeah, and which, by the way, and I have to say, I have a Star Wars Episode 1 shirt that I've had for years, probably ever since the movie came out, and somehow it still fits me. I don't know how. It must have been really oversized when I got it when I was younger. But every time I've worn that out to public over the many years that I've had it, it's one of the shirts that I've most often gotten compliments about. And it's by fellow, not just like prequel fans, but Episode 1 fans in particular, who give me a thumbs up and they say, I love that shirt, man. It just goes to show that, we're out there, and, it's one of my big things about, I don't want to expand this into a larger conversation, but it is one of the things about the internet and social media at large, that it sort of amplified the sort of angry minority voice that thinks it's the majority, you know. And if you actually talk to people out in the real world, you know, they want to talk about the things they love. They want to cheer on the things that were special to them growing up. And just the fact that I've gotten so many, like, I've had so many joyful conversations come out of me just wearing a shirt out and about, and it just brings a smile to my face. And so I'll be wearing that shirt on that stream, and we're gonna have a great time talking about a movie that has given me so much joy over the years.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
That's what we want to do here on this channel is celebrate the movies that we love, and if there's and hopefully you'll join us in you know, making that attempt as Céline would want you to.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about that, but to be clear, that'll be not our next stream, but the stream after. So next week we're off. The week after, we're talking about the end of Star Wars: The Bad Batch, and then the week after that will be the Phantom Menace. Mm-hmm. So yeah, now I'm actually really looking forward to the week off.
Yeah,
I was telling Jared before that, because you know, as we mentioned before, there's a bunch of movies out in theaters this week that I'm looking forward to going and seeing. But also, I've got a lot of TV shows I want to catch up on. Some reading I want to do. I started reading Dune Messiah this week.
Oh, nice.
Which I wasn't originally going to do, but then I looked at the book, and it's actually, in comparison to Dune, it's a much shorter book.
Yes.
So I thought, oh, let me just dive into it. And it's interesting because right off the bat, there's some stuff in it that, like, I was not expecting.
Yeah.
You know, character wise, like, and you know, so it's interesting. So I'm looking forward to spending some time on that. And then I've got a slew of Star Wars books that I picked up a couple days ago. I picked up in paperback all three of the first of the newer Thrawn books. Like Thrawn Alliances, and Thrawn Treason. Also picked up some Legends books, Shatterpoint, the
I love that book so much.
The episode 3 novelization, which are both written by the same author. The Obi-Wan Kenobi book. And I picked up something else, but I forget what it was. But I've got a lot of material. I just remember going out to the bookstore and being like, especially because I've been talking to you about how I want to spend less time on social media and stuff. So I was like, I want to pick up a huge pile of books to just immerse myself in. And so that's the plan. We'll see if it works out that way, or if I just have a bunch of books added to my shelf. But yeah, no, it's I'm having a good start with Dune Messiah. Enjoying that one. I've got also picked up Children of Dune as well, but but we'll see how quickly I get to that.
I don't think we're seeing the cinematic adaptation of that one, so that'll be purely for your
like, we're already getting into, like, even in the early pages of Dune Messiah, I see we're already getting into clones of dead people. So so I'm like, wow, it's already getting weird.
Just now.
But the great thing is, and sorry, I'm carrying on this conversation. We'll wrap up in a minute here, but I am happy that now when I read Aaliyah's character, I can just picture Anya Taylor-Joy instead of weird 4-year-old Aaliyah freaking people out. But yeah, no, it's enjoying it. I will say that my and we might not talk about this anytime soon, which allows me to bring it up a bit now, but because we just recently did our discussion of Doom Part 2, but I will say, I think and maybe this will be sacrilege for some Dune fans out there, but I actually really find myself liking Denis film adaptations a lot more than the book itself. I like the structuring of the story better, and a lot of the design aesthetic, which is very unique to Denis' version, and and the way certain character beats happen in little bit different order from the book, and I just think that for me it's the more satisfying experience. But that said, I'm still enjoying the books as they are, but I'm imagining reading Dune Messiah that it's going to be quite different when we get the cinematic version. I'll be interested to see in what ways that's the case.
I think it will be. But I just hope we see it, sooner rather than later, because it very much is in keeping. At least the thematic ending of that book is very much in keeping with the story that Denis has been telling. And then the later books kind of muddle it, so I'm glad they're going to be. But yeah, we're going to enjoy the week off. Lots of good stuff to get to. Hope you will consider rewatching Before Sunrise before your rental expires, and then when you're ready, picking up Before Sunset and Before Midnight. Because now that I got you on the first one, I'm hoping that we can still we can finish the trilogy at some point.
Oh yeah,
as
definitely.
I said, these movies are very personally important to me, and I very much am thankful that you were willing to watch it for the first time, and I hope that anyone else out there who was experiencing the ride for the first time, that you also found it rewarding. And so thank you all.
I will say I'm glad that it's a 48-hour rental. Because at first I thought if I was going to rewatch it, it was going to have to be immediately following the stream. Yeah. But actually, I'll have a little bit more time to get to it. So that's a good thing. Once again, thank you everybody for watching. Sorry for a bit of the rambling at the end. We covered a bunch of different topics, but hey, sometimes I enjoy that. It allows us to go into unforeseen territory. And once again, my man, happy birthday, and hope you have a good time celebrating with your family, and and like I said before, enjoy 35, man. It's a good age.
I think so, and I think that this next year will be good things are coming, personally and professionally. So I'm happy. You're happy. We're all doing a good job here, just figuring our way out through this thing called life.
And on that note, I think that's a perfect way to end. So I hope you all have a wonderful night, and we'll see you not next week, but the week after.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.
Goodbye. Au revoir. Later. Bring me the horns of Wilmington's cow.
Nice.